Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're exploring a seriously profound shift in how humans coordinate with each other. We're going to be looking at decentralized Web3 R&D labs, but not just as some niche tech experiments. No, we're looking at them as living, breathing ecosystems that could ultimately save our rigid legacy organizations from total extinction. Let's jump right in.
Okay, let's dive into this. Think about the existing organizational paradigm, the one most of us are probably working in today. It's becoming increasingly incompatible with the superfluid, AI-native world we actually live in right now. Traditional institutions? They were engineered a lot like mechanistic ships, built for very stable, predictable environments. They rely on fixed locations and those old-school industrial-era coordination costs. But here's the thing. As the waters of our global economy get deeper, way more transnational, and just infinitely more complex, these rigid structures are acting like sinking ships. They're struggling to stay afloat in an environment they were literally never designed for. So, what on earth is the alternative?
Well, the contrast is pretty stark. Traditional institutions basically assume fixed jurisdictions, rigid hierarchies, and heavily centralized decision-making. Decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs, absolutely shatter those assumptions. DAOs are transnational by default, they're open, often pseudonymous, and they govern across multiple digital channels. Now, to be totally fair here, early DAOs were often a pretty chaotic, honestly flawed first attempt at this structural evolution. They were messy, sure, but they introduced a kind of fluidity that traditional organizations desperately lack.
But that early chaos actually taught us a critical lesson, and it's summed up perfectly by this idea. Governance is not reducible to execution. Back in the early days of Web3, there was this massive fallacy going around known as code is law. The whole idea was that you could just encode governance into deterministic smart contracts and let the tech run the whole show. But that completely fails in practice. I mean, smart contracts can execute math flawlessly, right? But they absolutely cannot resolve human ambiguity. If a rule is technically executed but universally hated by the community, well, the code works, but the organization fails. Treating governments purely as code completely ignores the actual social processes that determine what rules should even exist in the first place.
Now, what's really interesting about this concept is how we're fundamentally reconceptualizing these structures. The DAO345 Foundation proposes that we actually stop looking at DAOs as just mere software artifacts and start viewing them as open, self-sustaining, living ecosystems. They're socio-technical systems embedded in much larger environments. By actually using nature as a model, as a measure, and as a mentor, we can engineer organizations that don't just blindly execute code, but actually live, breathe, and adapt to their surroundings. It's a total game changer.
So, for these living legal organisms to survive, they absolutely have to balance what are called the 3 E's of governance. First up, effectiveness. That's just about actually achieving the organization's goals. Then there's efficiency, which ensures the sustainable use of resources. We're talking about shifting away from extractive models to truly regenerative ones. But the third E, that is where the real paradigm shift happens. Ethics. In this biological model, focusing on human development and dignity isn't just some corporate social responsibility checkbox you tick off. Ethics is treated as a vital structural necessity. Think of it kind of like the organism's immune system. Without it, the organism eventually just rejects itself. To protect that living, ethical core, these organizations utilize what we call a cybernetic exoskeleton. Now, think of the famous Strand Beasts by the artist Theo Jansen. You know, those massive, wind-powered kinetic structures that actually walk across beaches on their own? Well, in a biomimetic DAO, the technological stack of blockchain, smart contracts, and AI agents functions as that exact kind of exoskeleton. It automates the governance, it enforces multi-jurisdictional compliance, and it provides real-time adaptive responses to external stimuli. Basically, it gives the soft, human, living organism inside the incredibly rigid armor it needs to survive the harsh elements of the market. And this brilliantly illustrates how we bring abstract theory into rigorous real-world application. Looking at a Web3 enterprise risk management framework, you can see how it maps out every single hazard. Take governance risks, for example, things like Sybil attacks or voter apathy. By meticulously categorizing these right alongside financial, operational, and legal uncertainties, we're basically creating a blueprint. It proves that the decentralized space isn't just the Wild West anymore. By developing these robust risk management practices tailored specifically for Web3, we are building something incredibly valuable, and more importantly, totally exportable to traditional businesses that are looking to decentralize safely. A super key feature of this resilient exoskeleton is exactly how it handles information. Traditional organizations, and even some of those early DAOs,
often rely on sporadic voting to make decisions. But living institutions, they sense and regulate themselves through continuous feedback loops. Plus, in this model, failure is actually treated as an ecological signal. So, when we analyze institutional collapses in the Web3 space, like, say, the spectacular multi-billion-dollar failure of Terra/Luna, we don't just see a financial loss, we see an ecological postmortem. We learn exactly how to build better governance latency and way stronger self-regulation for the next iteration. Let's move on and see how this builds into something even bigger. Because as these living organizations grow, they face a whole new challenge. Just like in the deep sea, scaling up complexity actually requires an evolutionary leap. You can't just be a giant single-celled amoeba forever. You have to transition to multicellular architecture. As DAOs and modern organizations scale up, if they just remain this flat, undifferentiated mass, they inevitably degrade. They become slow, they become unresponsive, and ultimately highly vulnerable.
And honestly, that leads right to those chronic Web3 and, let's face it, corporate problems, decision paralysis, voter apathy, and hidden centralization, where just a few whales or top executives effectively run the whole show behind the scenes. The cure for this? Breaking down those flat hierarchies and replacing them with networks of specialized, semi-autonomous, yet deeply interdependent cells or sub-DAOs. This multicellular approach means that decisions are actually made locally by the specific cells that have the context and the expertise. That drastically increases engagement and prevents the entire system from just getting bogged down. Now, a successful multicellular organization essentially has three core traits. First up is recursivity, meaning it can literally rewrite its own rules to evolve. Second is coherence, making sure that digital community consensus perfectly matches up with real-world legal commitments. And third is adaptive stability. This is the incredible ability to change internal configurations in response to the environment, all while preserving the organization's core identity and functional integrity without just collapsing into total fragmentation. So why does all of this matter outside the digital realm? Well, because these mechanisms are already being applied to the physical world right now. Through initiatives like the DAO345 coral reefs models, we're seeing DAO consensus mechanisms being used for decentralized science, where funding and research are crowd-governed rather than being gate-kept by massive corporations, and for huge institutional coordination. Just imagine aligning the efforts, the funding, and the data sharing of global researchers, local governments, and legacy institutions all seamlessly. It's really about stepping away from the computer screen and actually using these decentralized tools to solve real, highly complex coordination problems in our physical environment. And this brings us to the ultimate goal. And honestly, the real reason all of this matters, saving our legacy organizations. By incubating these models in the wild Web3 sandbox, we have developed the exact tools traditional corporations are going to need to survive. First, we export the decentralized ERM to secure their operations. Second, we introduce biomimetic leadership, which completely shifts management from a model of top-down dominance to one of ecological stewardship and distributed intelligence. And finally, we help them transition into minimum viable institutions. These are lean, highly resilient entities optimized for survival and adaptation, rather than just blind, unchecked growth. So, the crucial point is that this transition isn't just theoretical anymore. The legal bridges are literally being built as we speak. We're actually interfacing programmable code with real-world legal wrappers. Surprisingly enough, places like the Cayman Islands are acting as major hubs for this. They're utilizing foundation companies to help traditional entities safely adopt these biomimetic decentralized traits. They can map community consensus directly into legally legible, binding off-chain commitments. It's fascinating stuff. We are officially entering the network state era, a time of transnational communities and highly programmable economic systems. The decentralized experiments running in DAOs today, they are actively pressure testing the life rafts that legacy organizations are going to desperately need tomorrow. So I'll leave you with this final thought. As the environment around us becomes increasingly complex and fluid, will your organization embrace the cybernetic exoskeleton and adapt to the deep waters of the future? Or will it just sink, weighed down by the rigid mechanistic structures of the past? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.